So hopefully, after 5 weeks in our series that we've been talking about church vision, that you guys are starting to get a decent grasp of the personal side of our vision. I still want to go over it a little bit this morning just so that you're fresh on it. So remember, as individuals, we're tasked with pursuing Christ at all times, right, in everything we do. Yet the way that we do that is something that should be balanced, right? First of all, we balance where we spend our time, making sure we spend enough time in connect at church, but also enough time influence outside of the church. But we also balance how we spend our time when we're in those places. We balance that by making sure that we give God enough time to inflow into us to build up our strength, and then we overflow as we serve, right? Now, last week I gave you all a challenge, and I hope that at least most of you paid attention to it and really took some time to do it. If you don't remember, the challenge was to examine your life. To ask yourself the question, is my life balanced? Am I balancing these things out, or am I starting to struggle? So how many of us in here feel like our lives, as far as those four things are concerned, are pretty balanced? How many of us feel like we're pretty balanced? Okay, good, most of us. How many of us feel like we're just slightly off kilter? Okay, a couple. So I have to see some of the same hands going up. I'm so off kilter I can't even make up my mind right now. About to vote for the third one too. How many of us are just completely out of control? Okay, just me. All right, okay. So what we're going to do this morning is we're going to switch to the other side of things now. We're going to take a look at church structure. Or we're going to look at how we do things as a church and how it's going to relate to the same four things that we've been talking about. If you're following along in your sermon notes this morning, today's message is called Let's Do This, Part 1. Now, as we start looking at the church side of things, you're going to notice that you're going to see a lot of stuff that we are already doing. I told you kind of from the beginning of this series that I've really put some time into this, and it's based on some experience that I had when I was in North Carolina. When I first arrived in Greensboro, North Carolina, I came as a youth pastor. And I had left LifePoint Church in California. Now, LifePoint in California was very small and unique. And LBC had twice as many people as California, but even just a few years before that, they had 6 times as many people. Now, LifePoint had a very strong emphasis on homeless ministry and had a very encouraging community. And LBC was more focused on big events, and they had generations of very dedicated families. LifePoint had a great life group structure, and everyone was involved in just about everything we did. LBC had a really great Sunday school program, and it was subdivided into groups based on age and gender and things like that. LifePoint valued change, and they had a willingness to love just about anybody that walked through the doors. LBC valued tradition, and they had very high standards for their people. Now, neither one of those churches was better than the other, right? They're both good things, they're just different. But I thought that me walking in, that I had it figured out, that I knew the right way to do it, and I was going to fix all these people. Just admitting that. Now, I was ready to kind of do everything my way, which is why about a year later I sat down to resign, because that wasn't the way to do it. I learned a lot of lessons during that season, but really more reflecting on that time after I left, giving a chance to look at myself and be honest with myself and mistakes that I've made. Some of the lessons that I learned were that fit really matters. Okay, and the best way to find out if you're going to be a good fit is to be honest beforehand. I also learned that as a leader, the people around you matter, and you need to listen to them. And I also learned that you should take time to learn how and why things are done before you go in and just start changing things. So I told you at the beginning of our vision series that I took 4 years before beginning to present this to you. And that largely comes as a result of taking time to learn from all of you and to learn how and why we do things and to figure out what we might do. I admit that one of my favorite parts of woodworking is sanding. Not when it's a big project, but I like what sanding does. It takes everything you've done and it just cleans it up and gives you a nice polished final product. Because all the roughness and the pieces that were glued together start looking smooth, and it just starts looking like one piece of furniture. All the splinters and the rough spots kind of disappear. And so that's what the structural part of our vision really is the sanding, right? We've taken what we're already doing and we've polished it up just a little bit. So here we go. Our structure is based on 4 things. And it's the same 4 things that we've been talking about this whole time. They are connect, grow, serve, influence. Good. So as we started building this process, we wanted a couple things to happen. First, we wanted to make sure that we had uniformity on the big stuff, but flexibility in the details. We also wanted a process that was going to be in place that we could all understand, that would encourage growth and encourage community in our church. And of course, we also wanted it to be simple. Simple is good. I think if you remember back in week 1, I explained the benefits of simplicity and the pitfalls of complexity. Leonardo da Vinci actually said, simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. And I thought, I want to be a sophisticated church. So let's be simple, but let's also be effective, all right? So remember what happened when Jesus' disciples were caught picking wheat by the Pharisees, right? I've referred to this a lot in the last year, so I don't know why this verse just keeps sticking out in my head. But basically, his disciples were walking. It was the Sabbath. They were picking wheat, and the Pharisees come in, and it's like, oh, you're working on the Sabbath. Gotcha, right? And in Mark 2:27, Jesus says, and he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. He's like, you guys got things backwards. This Sabbath day was meant to be a day that we honored God and that we got the rest that we needed to stop, to quit being busy all the time, right? And yet the Pharisees took that, or really just the Jews over, it's not just the Pharisees' fault, right? They took this thing that was supposed to be refreshing and turned it into a legalistic burden, right? Turned it into something it was never supposed to be. Well, I want to make sure that our process doesn't do that same thing. Right? Our process is meant to help our church be simpler, more efficient, more liberated, more unified, and even holier. Right? It's not meant to be the thing that confuses us and just makes us more stressed and bogs us down. It's like, I got to remember it's like, no, this is supposed to make things easier for us. And so the idea of these 4 steps is to help us understand where we're going and what we're doing, to focus on what's important, and to move people along the process together. Okay? So the first part here that we're going to get started with, big shocker, is connect. All right, we're starting off with connect. This step is all about being introduced to the church, or you might say, connecting to us. All right? And this step is for you, whether this is your first Sunday here or you've been here for 20 years. All right? Connect refers to all the times that we assemble together as a unified body. It's when all of us have a chance to connect with each other and new people have a chance to connect to us and check us out. All right? So this morning, instead of doing your regular fill in the blanks, if you grabbed your Connect card, you're going to be filling in our church structure steps. So just letting you know, it's a little bit different than normal. So the first one under Connect is this, Sunday morning services. But also, we have special events as well, and that also does the same thing. You know, it's often easier to ask your neighbors to come to a movie night or a bowling night than it is to invite them to church on Sunday. But it's also easy in both of these things for them to get a feeling for what our community is like, right? And you might think, well, but we want to go do things as a whole church like door knocking or street preaching or revivals or other large evangelistic type things. And I think those are good things, and there are some people who are just very specifically gifted in those ways. But personally, as a church, I think there are better ways to do that as a whole. And specifically, I think the best way is to follow Jesus' example from the book of John. In John chapter 1, verse 38, it says, Jesus turned and saw them following and said to them, what are you seeking? And they said to him, Rabbi, which means teacher, where are you staying? And he said to them, come and you will see. Okay, that's the first time Jesus says this, but he also says this on other occasions. Jesus says, you want to know what I'm all about? Come and you'll get it. Okay? Jesus doesn't sit down and give them some elaborate gospel presentation at this point, right? Actually, we really don't see that from Jesus in the scriptures hardly at all, right? So we don't really see a detailed step-by-step outline covering all the intricacies and prophecy and signs and all these things, right? Mostly what we see in the Bible is Jesus says, come and hang out with me for a while, right? This word here for staying means to abide or to remain with. Abide with me is what Jesus says. So if you want to remain with Jesus, the best way is to come see it for yourself. Basically, what I'm saying here is what we would say to people that might want to be a part of us is to say, hey, come check us out. Be a part of our community, and then you're going to get it. Right? I'm not just going to give you some graph or some handout or something like that. Like, I want you to see it. And so Sunday services and special events are introductory for new people. But then you might be thinking, but I've been here forever, so why do I have to keep going to church if that's where the new people are connecting? You know, a lot of people make that famous statement that we talked about in week 2, right? You don't need to go to church to be a Christian. Well, you might remember that the writer of Hebrews didn't agree with that thought. In Hebrews 10:24, it says, and let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. We're supposed to come together to encourage each other because being a Christian isn't just about getting us into heaven, right? It's not just about saying, okay, I'm saved, I got what I want, now I can go back to doing whatever I want to do, right? No, we have a special role in the greater community. So, and the truth is, even if you've been at this church for 20 years, you still have a role here, even on Sunday mornings, right? Because a new person comes into church and they get introduced to the body, but then they've been here for a while and they become the person that the new people are being introduced to become part of the body, right? It's a cyclical thing. So you don't just get introduced and then disappear, you get introduced and then you become part of the body that new people will want to be a part of, okay? It's also important on Sunday morning, in addition to all the teaching and everything that we do, it's important that connections are made between people, that friendships are made. How many of us have ever heard of Dunbar's number before? Just me and Jacob. Okay. This will be fun. So Dunbar came up with a theory about community based on the brain size to body ratios in primates, all right? And from that, he noticed the pattern, and he cross-checked it with humans, and he found even more patterns. And it turns out that human beings can only handle so much information about relationships. So we have relationship limits as people. And so humans naturally then have layers in their social networks. So basically, here's a chart here, and there's these different levels, and basically you have friendships in each one of these zones that looks very different for most people, okay? Now, your inner circle, the smallest circle there, has about 5 people in it. Dunbar calls this your support clique. If you don't believe me, check the call list on your phone. Odds are 80% of most people's phone calls are made to the same 4 or 5 people. That is probably your support clique, okay? It's probably your spouse, maybe your best friend, maybe your kids or your parents, all right? But then outside of that small group of 5, you have what's called your sympathy group, all right? This is made up of about 12 to 15 people, all right? And you'll notice that each of these roughly triple in size every time you go up. Not exactly, but close enough, right? Now, literally, Dunbar's criteria for this, if you want to know if you're going to be in somebody's 12 to 15 people, these are the people who would be devastated if you died. So if you die, about 12 people are going to care. That's not what that means. 12 people would be devastated, okay? These are the 12 people that would, like, the rest of their life would remember that death, right? That it would affect them even 20 years from now, okay? That's what that means. It doesn't mean that, nobody's going to be sad at your funeral or something like that. People will still be sad and they still will be affected, but you're going to have about 12 to 15 people that will be devastated. It will rock their life. It will be a hard thing for them to get through, okay? These people are defined as people who share a common interest, solve challenges through facilitated conversation to put their own strategies into practice and assess their benefits. Okay? Now, just outside of this is the affinity group, and this group is, it says 35 up there, but usually it's actually about 50 people. 35 to 50, we'll call it that. So this affinity group, these are the people that you're around often enough to where you would ask them for help, right? If you need something, you're not afraid to ask them for help. But your relationship doesn't really go deeper than that as far as an emotional level, right? You're not going to lean on them if you have a real mental or emotional issue that you need to deal with, okay? But you can connect with them over a cup of coffee a couple times a year, and you see them, it's like, oh man, we should do this again, like that kind of relationship, okay? But then you reach your full active network, okay? These are the people that we call our friends. Now, church, I hate to break it to you, you might have 400 friends on Facebook, but you don't really have 400 friends, okay? Look at your friends list. You're going to see a lot of people that you haven't seen in the last year or two, or since high school or whatever, right? Those aren't your friends. Those are actually people in the next circle out, okay? So there's a lot of things that happen at this 150 level, all right? And if we look around history and different cultures and stuff like that, we see a lot of things that limit themselves at 150, okay? There are about 20 tribal societies in the world that have census data. And of those 20, you want to guess what their average size is? 153. You know what the average head count is that gets invited to a wedding that's not like a small courthouse type thing, like registered? It's 148. Neolithic tribes were all between 120 and 150 people. The oldest population survey we can find is called Domesday, which is from 1086 with William the Conqueror. What do you think the average village size in England was in the 11th century? 150. Okay, Gore-Tex, it's a company that makes clothing. They specifically limit the size of their factories because Robert W. Gore noticed that once a factory gets above a certain number of people, the necessary corporate hierarchy that it takes to maintain it becomes inefficient. Guess what that number is? 150, right? So that's why this 150 happens to be the cap of a social group that can work really well together. And then that number sort of triples again to 500, which is the number of acquaintances that you can have. All right, people that you'll walk up to and be like, hey, you might sit down to a meal with them every so often. Or you might just see them at another event and go, oh, hey, right? And outside of that is the 1,500 there, and that's the number of faces you can recognize, right? The 1,501st face you see, no idea, even if you've seen them before, all right? And so we build on that on Sunday together when we come together, right? This idea of 150. Our church just happens to be in that range, plus or minus 20 people as far as the whole scope. We have less than that on Sunday, but out of our whole church pool, we're probably about that, maybe a little bit more, somewhere in that pocket, right? So it makes sense then that we would intentionally want to come together to make sure that we maintain something, right? And if we got bigger than that, then we would just have to separate different pockets, right? That's why first service tends to know more people at first service, second service tends to know more at second, right? So there's this idea of a pocket about that size that you know. So it makes sense that at Healthy Church, we would develop those relationships at that level, right? So when we come together on Sunday and at church-wide events, those are two things that are good for us to build community, and it's also a landing point for new people, okay? Psalm 133:1 tells us, behold how good and pleasant it is when brothers dwell in unity. See, it's important that when we come together, we're unified under the goodness of God. However, we would never just gather as 150 people all the time, right? Because as I said, there's limits to the type of relationship you can have at 150. Like, we're not just going to get together so that we can have coffee as a church once a year. Like, that doesn't make any sense, right? So we need to have deeper relationships. And as I mentioned Dunbar's number, we just don't have the brain capacity to do more than that. So people need to move on to the next thing, to get deeper community than just Sunday morning. So we're going to start something called Next Steps. Okay, this is actually your next fill in the blank. Promoting something called Next Steps. It's not really part of our process. But basically think of it this way, right? Like these 4 things that we're doing are something that we're always doing, all 4 of these things. So if you think of it kind of like an engine running, well, you got to get it started. You got to turn the key. So next steps is like the starting of the cycle, okay? So really this is a 2-part thing. So basically what we're going to be doing is after church, maybe once a month, we haven't totally figured all that out yet, it's going to get started after this series. There's going to be lunch for new people to come together to meet me or staff or whatever. And in this lunch, we're going to make some connections. We're going to answer some questions. And then we're also going to go over the process to make sure everyone gets it. Okay? As part of Next Steps, we're going to have a series of videos on our website that explains the process so people at any time can learn or be reminded about what our process actually is. Okay? Now, most of you will probably never go to one of these lunches. You know why? Because you're already here. You're listening to it right now. There's no need for you to kind of go through that. So why do you need to know that Next Steps is a thing then? If you're probably never going to go to one, why do you need to know what it is? Well, in the first message in this series, I gave some problems with complicated churches. And you might remember that one of the problems is that a new person might come in and love the church and go, this is great, I love it here. What do I do next? And if you meet the wrong person or the right person or whatever, and it's like, oh, well, I'm over the prayer ministry. You should come to prayer night. Or, oh, I'm a life group leader. You should come to my life group. Right? You get different answers depending on different people. Well, the reason you all need to know that Next Steps is a thing is because someday a new person's going to come in and say, I love it here. What's next? And you're going to say, Next Steps. Go to the Next Steps lunch so you can figure out what we're all about. Okay? And that it makes sense because then people are going to go, oh, I get this. Now we're all on the same page, right? And so at this point, a new person would have been to church and or an event, right? And so they would have done the connect portion. And then they would also then understand the balance between connect, grow, serve, and influence in their personal life and what our church process actually is, okay? And then when they leave Next Steps, they will know that the next thing they need to do is go to the next part of our process. Anybody want to guess what that one's called? It's called grow. Okay, the grow portion of our church process helps us to build deeper communities between Christians, all right? Now, Jesus had all sorts of layers of community too, right? At one point, we know he reached at least 5,000 people, right? He also left behind a church group of about 120 people. He also had people that were close enough to him to be able to be sent, and that was about 70 people. And then he also had these 12 guys. You may have heard of them before. These guys are called the disciples, or the apostles, right? He spent all his time with them. He taught them and he served them, yes, but he just did life with them, right? He just walked with them. He shared meals with them. He had conversations with them. So wouldn't it make sense then that we would encourage people in our church to also have groups like that? Where you're hanging out with 5, 10, 15 people from within our church to build deeper relationships, right? Groups that you really do life with. I don't know, we could call them something like, I don't know, maybe life groups. So that's your next fill in the blank under grow, life groups. If you don't know, a life group is a group of 12, 20 people, 5 people, whatever, that meet regularly. Now those groups give us opportunity to build Christian relationships together. And they're pretty flexible in a lot of areas. If you're in a life group, you know that your group may be very different from another group. You know, at our church, we have 2 different life group seasons. All right, and we encourage you to, when you first get here, you're first figuring this out, go to a couple life groups if you want, you know, kind of figure out which one's going to be the best fit for you. We have 2 seasons. One is spring, one is fall. We're kind of in the middle of the spring season right now. But some groups, they choose to go right through the breaks at summer and Christmas, and they just keep on meeting. That's okay. Some groups meet every week. Some groups meet every other week. Some groups have a meal together. Some just have desserts and snacks together. Some don't do any food at all. Some have childcare. Some just don't need it. You know, every week I provide questions. You can see them right now on your Connect card. There's 6 questions on there that life groups go over together, and they're based on the sermon. But some groups decide to do their own study. Whatever their group is going through at the time, they find something together that makes sense. Some groups tend to have younger families. Some are retired couples. Some are spread out anywhere in between. So you can really see that every group is different from group to group to group, right? And so I encourage you to be willing to try a few. But once you get into one and you really like it, then I encourage you to stick with it. Because building those relationships over time are very important, right? These are people that you're going to see every Wednesday or maybe every Sunday. You know, Jesus spent 3 years with his guys every day. They had a lot of good times together, and they also had a lot of tough times together. And that's one of the good things about life groups, church, is because the Christian walk can be very messy. Because people are just messy. You know, these guys, they dedicated their lives to following Jesus, so you know they were serious, right? They were serious about following Christ. And yet, at the end, one of them betrayed him for 30 pieces of silver, one of them denied him, and the rest all just kind of ran away. You know, in Colossians 3:12, it tells us this: put on then as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience, bearing with one another. And if one has a complaint against another, forgiving each other. As the Lord has forgiven you, so you must also forgive. Also, Proverbs 17:17 tells us, a friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for adversity. So even though the disciples messed up before Jesus' death, Jesus came back to them, and he still used those same guys. Jesus didn't let the mistakes of his friends ruin his relationship with them. Jesus knew that being in a community with a couple of guys that tightly, it's going to get messy. It's going to happen. But Jesus exercised forgiveness, right? He encouraged them. He worked with them, and then they got better. See, when the Bible describes what a good community looks like, it looks something like this in Acts 2:42, verse 40 through 47. And you'll see that our life groups are really based on this concept. Verse 42 says, and they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and the fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers. And awe came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were being done through the apostles. And all who believed were together and had all things in common. And they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all as any had need. And day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they received their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to their number day by day those who were being saved. See what's happening there, church? This community comes together, some things happen, and as a result, other people go, hey, I want to be a part of that. Right? And what's interesting here is when you look at this, what are they doing that's so incredible? Honestly, they're not really doing anything that's like super crazy awesome. I mean, yes, it says the apostles were doing amazing things, right? But everybody else is just living like family. They ate meals together. They sold their stuff, not because they had to, but because they wanted to care for other people. They praised God together, and they were devoted to the teaching of the apostles. All of those are things we can still do today, church. Think about it. And that's why we have life groups, so you can have that type of community. And then from there, you'll probably make some connections that you might want to go even deeper with, right? Even deeper than just meeting the 12, 15 of you together. For the second part of the Grow programming, it's this: disciple-making friendships. disciple-making friendships. This is a close relationship between 2 or 3 people, something like that, growing together in the Lord, intentionally. Proverbs 27:9 tells us, oil and perfume make the heart glad. And the sweetness of a friend comes from his earnest counsel. That was the important part. If you remember the discipleship series that we did a couple of years ago, we talked about this. Anybody remember this formula? TW plus K4 times D3? Anybody remember that? Okay, a couple of us, all right. So I'm going to break this down for us just to give us a reminder. Okay, so let's put TW up there. What does TW stand for? Time with. All right, time with. You have to spend time with people together if you're going to grow as disciples. A lot of us think, oh yeah, spending time with people, that's an aspect of discipleship. No, discipleship is spending time with people, right? It's not just reading a book or something like that. You should have personal Christian relationships with people. The new Christian needs someone to invest in them. Your good friend that talks with you about everything is someone that should be a disciple-making friendship. Your spouse that you live with every day is an opportunity for that. Your kids who depend on you for learning about Jesus is an opportunity to have a disciple-making friendship. And what do you do when you're with those people? Well, we talked about hunting and NASCAR. Okay, great, but that doesn't really encourage people in their walk with the Lord, right? Not that you can't talk about those kind of things, but it has to go deeper. You need K4, right? And so K4 is Kavanaugh. It's a target or an intention. So when you're with that person, you're intentionally going after Scripture, prayer, love, and worship, right? Or more specifically, it's studying Scripture to know God, living a life of prayerfulness, and then also extravagant love, which God extravagantly loves us, and then we overflow that and extravagantly love others. And then, of course, all of life is worship. And then this should be done on a D3 level, which essentially means multiplication, okay? If you're doing things alone, that would be D1. If you and another person are doing things, that would be D2. But if you two are intentionally encouraging each other to go repeat this process with other believers, to share the kingdom of God with other people, and to encourage growth in other people, well, now you're talking about D3, all right? So church, that's pretty simple, right? That's pretty much the whole grow phase right there. Get into a life group and have disciple-making friendships. There is one other thing I want to throw out there too, though. The last thing under grow is off-season specials. And I may change the name of this. I came up with it this week, and I don't know if I like it or not. But right now, it's off-season specials. And I don't know how I feel about the name, but I do know that I really like that this is built into our structure, okay? Because sometimes I think it's good for us to tackle specific things in our church that just may not fit into a life group type format, okay? How do you tackle marriage issues in a life group if not everyone in your life group is married, right? How do you tackle issues with kids if not everyone in your group is a parent? How do you tackle pornography if you're embarrassed and no one in your group struggles with it? Okay? Well, during those off seasons of life groups, probably more in the summer than the winter, we want to do special things like that, give opportunities to do special studies and things like that. That way, we're not eliminating things that are important for the sake of going, well, we have a program and we're not leaving it, right? So that's why I like that flexibility being built in there. But even though there's flexibility, we're still dedicated and focused during the other 2 seasons, and I think that's really a good thing. All right? So let me talk about flexibility just a little bit. Because I know some people are going to come up to me afterwards and say, well, do I have to do all that? Right? If I'm going to be here, do I have to go to church every Sunday? Do I have to go to special events? Do I have to join a life group? Do I have to have disciple-making friendships? Do I have to go to the off-season stuff? And my response is, of course you don't have to. You don't have to. You can come to church and you can go home and not talk to anybody all week if you want to do that. But I don't recommend it. But you also might say, but you know what? I get my 15-ish people group time when I do my men's study on Saturday. Well, if those things are sufficient for you, you don't need to add a life group or make a formal commitment to another person if you're just the type of person that does those sorts of things organically. But if you're going to say, I'm not going to join a life group, I'm not going to do this because I have this other thing, I would just ask one thing from you. If you ever get to the point when you're struggling and you're thinking something like, I feel disconnected, or I need more help, or I need more scripture in my life, or I need more worship, if you get to that point, I would ask that you would consider the fact that a life group and disciple-making friendships might be the thing that you're missing. Ecclesiastes 4:9 tells us, 2 are better than 1 because they have good reward for their toil. For if they fall, one will lift up his fellow, but woe to him who is alone when he falls and has not another to lift him up. You know, church, from a leadership perspective, we need structure. But I also understand that some people can accomplish these things on their own in an organic way, and they don't need a program. They don't need to set a specific meeting time or place, but the truth is, a lot of us, probably most of us, actually do need that to help us accomplish it. And so I encourage you, be involved in our church as a whole, then be in a life group, and then be intentional with your friendships.